I'm Lourdes Lopez. I'm the Executive Director of Morphosis, the Wielden Company. A big highlight in my dancing career probably would have been when I was promoted to soloist, because I never really thought that I would get into New York City Ballet. I just thought that I just wasn't the type to get in. And once I got in there into the corps, there's this real sense that that's where most people stay. And I never quite felt like a real Balanchine dancer for some reason. So for him to have promoted me to a soloist, to me it meant that there was really hope that I could actually at one point become a principal. So I think when I look back, I think those were that day was one of the most personally fulfilling days for me. And there's an interesting, I always remember when I went up to him to thank him, it was during the Nutcracker season, I went up to him backstage, it was after performance, and I said, I just found out that I was promoted and I want to thank you, and I'd never, you do the usual, I never thought I would get it, and all of this, and he looked at me and he said, dear, I didn't do the work you did, so don't congratulate me. And that to me was incredible, because he moved the gift of the promotion that came from him. He gave it back to me. He kind of empowered the dancer to realize that you're being promoted because you've put a lot of work into this art form, period, end of story, not because of. And I just thought it was an interesting comment from him, because most of the time you get the director say, you're welcome, I'm so happy for you, but you never ever hear anybody saying, why are you thanking me? You did the work, I didn't. Was he possessive about dance, about ballet? Yes, he was. To him, he was an incredibly spiritual man and a mystical man. And I think he viewed ballet and dance as a religion. So you didn't walk on the stage in your shoes. You didn't throw the costumes on the floor. You were respectful to the musicians, the wardrobe mistresses, to everybody that allowed you to dance that night. You were respectful to, and he was the first one that said that. Was he possessive about his dancers? When I got in, it was towards the end of his life. It was like the last 14 years of his life. So I didn't quite see that much, but I understood how he could be, because he felt this was his family. He was possessive, I think, like a parent was possessive. And I think I think for him it worked, because it wasn't, you have to wear this and act this, and it was keeping you on track to make sure that you were moving in the direction that you wanted to move into. I think that was his possessiveness. And the other great thing about him is that there was no ego. I mean, even with Mr. Balanchine, you walked into that theater and you left your ego behind, because it wasn't about you, it wasn't about him, it was about this art form, and you had to have that kind of dedication and focus to it, or else why do it? I think Balanchine understood that no matter how talented he was, when the curtain went up, if there wasn't a dancer dancing his choreography, or somebody else's choreography for that matter, there's no reason. I mean, Balanchine's choreography lived in his head. Robin's choreography lived in his head. Christopher's choreography lives in his head. They need the instrument to make it happen. And I think that's why Balanchine ultimately was really so respectful of dancers, and he really was. He absolutely really was, because he understood he was just defeating himself by yelling and screaming and being a jerk. He didn't benefit from it. There was no benefit to that. And then I think also he was a gentleman. He was a gentleman, and like I said, I saw him get mad at a dancer because she put her costume on the floor, and he took her by the hand, went downstairs and said, do you see these women with glasses on hunching over sewing machines? They're here every day to make you look pretty at night. And it was those kind of messages that you realize that it was all a community, that you couldn't function without him and he couldn't function without you, and neither one could function without the seamstress, and you couldn't function without the musician and the state. And it was all this one kind of community, and I think that has for some reason maybe changed a little bit. We don't quite understand it as well. Maybe because we move around so much, I don't know. The biggest differences between when I was there and today, I think that when the dancers that were there for a reason when I was there. And we were there to dance, and we were there for Balanchine. And you saw very little turnover, hardly any turnover in terms of dancers, because you were at the forefront of something happening, and you couldn't go anywhere that was really any better. And I'm not so sure that that's really understood at this point. You know, with City Ballet, once you lose that founding father, the organizations do need to change, or they do need to kind of morph into something else. Not necessarily that it's better or worse, but they just have to morph and change into another organization or another institution. When I was there at City Ballet, it was not, it had some bureaucracy, but it was not an institution. It was still an arts organization. I think dancers, there's been a whole cultural change. You know, in other words, my generation versus your generation, very different human beings, very different information. My information was from a library. Your information is at the, in a nanosecond you can get any information you want. So there's the world has opened up. The world for you has become smaller, and the world for me when I was growing up was larger. So it's hard to fit those dancers into the past and today's dancers, or the past dancers into the future. I think dance is going through a very interesting, classical ballet is going through a very interesting change in terms of its dancers and its companies. I think dancers are becoming more mobile. I think they're not married or imprisoned to the idea that you have to stay somewhere for 20 years and make it work. I think they're open to opportunities. They say, look, 5 years, I'm not going anywhere, I'm going to try something else. And I think that's fabulous, because that doesn't mean that you don't love the art form. You can still come and watch performances, you can still become a physical therapist, you can still design, you can still contribute to the art form. You don't necessarily have to do it on stage. And that kind of information now, I think, has made the dancer different. You know what I'm saying? One of the reasons that I stopped is because I was offered this kind of summer position with Channel 4 WNBC in New York to cover the first Lincoln Center Arts Festival. And it was kind of at the time when I really wanted to stop already. I'd done 24 years and I had already been thinking that I wanted to move on to something else. And so I grabbed it. I said, I'm going to do this, and I'll do it for 8 weeks, and then I'll just see where I am. And I sort of, kind of, maybe not really enjoyed it, but it was an escape for me. It was a chance to get out. So I took it, and I did that for 2 years. I freelanced with them, and I really just hated it. And it wasn't that I had to dance. It was just, I just knew that it wasn't the right place for me. And then I went on to teach quite a bit and kind of help put this school together and put a syllabus for them to kind of move from a semi-professional to a professional school, and I did that for a few years. And then Barbara Horgan, which was Mr. Balanchine's right hand, like personal administrator, asked me to head the Balanchine Foundation. And at that point, I really didn't have an idea what that meant. And I said to her, well, at first I said no, then I said yes, and then I said no, then I said yes, and then I said I'll only do it if I can spend the summer there, kind of understanding because I don't, I have no idea what that meant. I had some information about the non-for-profit world, but so I did that for a summer, and I thought, it was such a small foundation. It was only 2 people, and very few projects, that it was really this perfect kind of, on-the-job training. So I did that for about 3 or 4 years, through the Balanchine Centennial. And then I kind of wanted to stop, but there were a lot of personal issues with my parents and things, and I had to travel home a lot because they were ill, and I just couldn't quite keep the 2 things going, so I left that. And then I remember there was a message that came from Alicia Alonso, from the Cuban ballerina, and I think she kind of views me as her daughter because I'm Cuban and I dance. And she sent me a message through a friend of mine saying, you've got to go back to dance. You've got to contribute to the art form what it gave to you. And she was absolutely right. She goes, the art form needs it, which is why I believe that, You know, when you stop dancing, you should give back to it in whether it's teaching or rehearsing or putting, you know, computer programs for it or whatever it is, but to be around it again and to contribute to it. And that's really what made me think, gee, you know, maybe I should kind of start to think this way, you know, be open to possibilities coming my way. And literally, it was a few months later that Chris called me from London and said, I have this idea, and you know, he'd been kind of talking about it for a while. And we sat down. I said, well, let's just do it.